retain much of their pagan heritage, and in fact this is why we have so much pagan heritage in our European culture, such as Beltane, such as the Christmas tree, which actually goes back into Old Testament times, etc. Number 4, the house of Judah later on was taken captive into Babylon for a period of 70 years, but returned to Judah, the land of Judah, and reestablished their kingdom. So there's an unbroken genealogy from King David all the way to Queen Elizabeth II, and we will demonstrate that to you. The house of Judah had a distinct mission in the land of Judah to bring forth the Messiah. After the Messiah was brought forth and he performed his atoning sacrifice for his people Israel, that's when the history of the house of Judah in Judea ends. But we pick it up in Europe because we European Caucasians are in fact his genealogical relatives. Number 6, that the various tribes of Israel founded numerous nations, first in Europe and then all over the world. And as a matter of fact, Britain and America were established by the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. That ultimately, the two houses would one day be merged back together, so that there would no longer be a separation of the two houses, and this was prophesied by the two sticks prophecy in the book of Ezekiel. Now in number 9, the nation where the physical reunification took place was in fact the United States of America, and this is according to prophecy. It's not that little nation in the Middle East of those unbelievers. Remember, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 6:14 not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. So what we are doing, we Americans and the rest of us true Israelites are doing by supporting that Jewish state, is we're actually supporting the Antichrist. We are not supporting the Christ at all, because that nation was never prophesied to be the regathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm going to prove to you today that the United States of America is the regathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. Also, and finally, just before the judgment day, these people who don't know who they are, but will remember who they are, will, just before the return of Christ, remember who they are and become the bride of Christ. Now we're going to continue in our historical study of the division of the 12 tribes into two houses. We will now turn to the book of 1 Kings, chapter 11, verses 26 through 42, and it tells us this. And Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zereda, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow woman, even he lifted up his hand against the king. This is telling us that there's going to be a civil war. I'm going to jump down to verse 31 and verse 30. And Ahijah caught a new garment that was on him and rent it into 12 pieces. This is the prophet Ahijah. And he grabbed this garment and tore it into 12 pieces. And this is what he said to Jeroboam after he did this. Take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith Yahweh, the God of Israel, behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to thee, speaking to Jeroboam, the Ephraimite. But he shall have 1 tribe for my servant David's sake, that is, the king of Judah, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. So here is where the Bible is declaring the civil war and the split, the breakup of the 12 tribes into two houses. Verse 33, because that they have forsaken me, and have worshipped Ashtoreth, or otherwise known as Astarte, the goddess of Easter, the goddess of the Zidonians. The Zidonians were a Canaanite tribe. Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon. These are all Canaanite tribes. And have not walked in my ways, to do that which is right in mine eyes, and to keep my statutes and my judgments, as David his father did. So Yahweh is clearly expressing his displeasure with the Israelite people here for engaging in Canaanite practices. Howbeit, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him prince all the days of his life after David, for David my servant's sake, whom I chose because he kept my commandments and my statutes. So Solomon and his genealogy will retain the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin, but Jeroboam and the northern 10 tribes will depart and ultimately, as we have been seeing, ultimately be taken captive into the wilderness of Europe. Okay? Verse 39, and I will for this afflict the seed of David, but not forever. This is a prophecy of the fact that they will be taken captive into Babylon a bit later. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, unto Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. And the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? And at the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Now this history of the breakup of the 12 tribes into 2 houses is extremely important. Now when Rehoboam sent a tax collector, Rehoboam is the descendant of Solomon, and Rehoboam was he instituted heavy taxation on all 12 tribes. But the 10 northern tribes objected to this heavy taxation. And when Rehoboam sent the tax collector Adoram into the north country, they stoned him to death. Just like we Americans don't like tax collectors today, our ancestors did not like tax collectors then. Verse 20 in 2 Kings chapter 12, and it came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam was come again, that they sent and called him unto the congregation, and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed after the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. And when Rehoboam was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin, and 180,000 chosen men, which were warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, to bring the kingdom again to Rehoboam the son of Solomon. So we here have evidence of a civil war, the breaking up of the 10 northern tribes away from the house of Judah. And in verse 24 we are told that this breakup is declared by Yahweh himself, for this thing is from me. So it's very important to understand that the 12 tribes were divided into 2 houses, the 10 northern tribes and the southern 2 tribes. Now continuing with the book of 1 Kings in chapter 12, it explains how Ahijah's prophecy to Jeroboam was fulfilled in Samaria, because Samaria became the capital of the 10 northern tribes. Verse 25, then Jeroboam built Shechem in Mount Ephraim, and dwelt therein, and went out from thence, and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David, Jeroboam being the king of the 10 northern tribes. And rather than allow his people to go down to Judah to make sacrifices, for fear that they might be repatriated to King Rehoboam, he forbade them to do so, and actually built a second temple in Shechem. And whereupon, verse 28, whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and said unto them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So now this new king of the 10 northern tribes instituted a new pagan religion in opposition to the Israelite religion, the house of Yahweh, which stayed in place in Judah, in the southern 2 tribes. In verse 33, so he offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised in his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel, and he offered upon the altar and burnt incense. So this is the beginning of the pagan religion that our ancestors brought with them into Europe. Now, verse 33. After this thing, Jeroboam returned not from his evil way, but made again of the lowest of the people priests, and of the high places. The high places being the Canaanite religion sources, with the practiced their religion on the mountaintops and in the groves. Whosoever would, he consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. So what Jeroboam did here was he created a new priesthood simply by selecting people that he favored and made them priests in opposition to the Levitical priesthood, which was still functioning in the house of Judah. Now, this type of disobedience was not liked by Yahweh our God, and during the continuing history of these people, we had a king called Omri. This king Omri was known to the Assyrians as Gomri, and it was known to the Greeks in a later period as Cumru. In fact, the Welsh people today still refer to themselves as the Cumru, because we will be demonstrating that the Cumru originated in Assyria, in Armenia, and migrated from Armenia to Wales, where they still speak fluent Hebrew. It's called Welsh today. And so as we trace the histories of these migrations, we find that we can indeed establish a linguistic, historical, and scriptural connection to our origin in the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm going to quickly digress into demonstrating the Welsh connection to the Hebrew language. For example, the word Aeth, meaning he went or he is gone, is in Hebrew atah, or A-T-H-A-H. The Welsh amel, meaning plentiful or ample, in Hebrew hamali, and Edom, Y-D-O-M, Adama. Awi, air or sky in Hebrew is Aor. In Welsh, B-U, bu, it came to pass, bo in Hebrew. Botan in Welsh, meaning belly, or betan in Hebrew. These are just a small sampling of the connections between Welsh and Hebrew. And the reason why Welsh still retains much of its Hebrew roots is because the Cimmerians, so-called, which are the original Welsh people, took their Hebrew language with them and migrated very quickly from Armenia all the way to Wales. Okay, and that's why they maintained their Hebrew language. But for the majority of the Israelites, we are told in Isaiah chapter 28, verse 11, that the majority of our people will get a new language. And we are told, for with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people. So for the majority of the Israelites, we will be speaking in a new language, and of course that new language is English. And we find that there are numerous idiomatic expressions in English that derive from the Hebrew. And I'm going to quote from a couple of scholars to demonstrate this. Quote, "The idiomatic likenesses between English and Hebrew were noticed by Tyndale when he translated the scriptures. He said, quote, 'The properties of the Hebrew tongue agreeth 1,000 times more with the English than with the Latin. The manner of speaking is in both one, so that in 1,000 places there need not be but to translate the Hebrew word for word into English.'" This is Tyndale speaking about his experience in translating the Old Testament into English. And what he's telling us is all he had to do is replace the Hebrew words with English words, not even worry about the syntax, and the sentences made perfect sense. Canon Lyson found in 5,000 Hebrew roots in the English language. Other authorities who put the figure higher, that there are way more than 1,000 places where the English and the Hebrew agree. He states, "The Welsh is so much like the Hebrew that the same syntax may be used for both. The Old Saxon language is said to be 80% Hebrew. The oldest poems in the Celtic language are in the Book of Dun Cow, composed in 1106 AD, and are not unlike the poetic passages in the Old Testament." So we find that when we actually access the history of the Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Caucasian people, and we access these historians, these old-time historians that are totally ignored today, that we show our connection to the old Hebrew people. So now I'm going to get into the subject of prophecy. And the fact is that when the 10 northern tribes were taken captive, it was in the year 745 BC, and the Assyrian king